Hi there, everyone. I'm Ty Collins, back once again, ready to go with the latest edition of the Lawrence University Career Center podcast, where we speak with Lawrence alum to find out what's happening in their lives post-Lawrence University. And this month, we continue with our recent alumni series, speaking with Lawrence grads from the past few years. And we are joined by Basil Eastman-Kiesow from the Lawrence class of 2021. Basil earned his bachelor's degree with a major in government, minors in econ and physics. While a student, he was involved with LUCC as both a Parliamentarian and Committee Chair. He worked on 2 research projects regarding national elections and immigration, and completed an internship with a member of the New York City Council. Today, Basil's entering his second year of law school at the University of Minnesota. Basil, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, man.
Basil, let's start with your decision to go to law school. I know it was one of a few different options you were considering while you were a student at Lawrence. You had interest in government and politics. What made you decide law was the right path for you, and what were some of the considerations you made before committing to a career in law and 3 more years of school?
Yeah, so law was always kind of in the back of my head ever since really middle school or high school as something I was interested in. I didn't really know if I would have had what it took or if I wanted to go through the extra schooling until my internship with the New York City Council in the summer of 2020, I believe. And it was really there working with constituents in Brooklyn and kind of seeing how, policy affects people's lives, where I kind of realized having that legal education was integral to being able to kind of work on those issues and help transform my communities, our communities, into places that were a little bit better for ordinary folks like myself. In terms of the additional schooling, I was pretty fortunate to go to a school like Minnesota, which is, Madison's the same way, which is really generous in terms of the aid it gives out. That was a big factor for me, and which is so rooted in like a public interest kind of philosophy, while also still having good private sector outcomes so that I could kind of keep my options open. I think I would just say I kind of came to my decision a little later than a lot of people do, not really fully realizing until the summer of my junior year that's what I wanted to do. And so in the end, I needed to take a little bit of additional time in order to make sure my application was as strong as possible. For anybody listening to this, if you decide 2 years after you graduate you want to go to law school, that's totally okay. You got to make a plan. You don't have to feel like you don't have to plan from the time you're a freshman on. It's more accessible than you'd think.
Yeah, and you did take a gap year. You took a 1-year break between Lawrence and law school. Talk more about why you did choose to do that, and how did you spend that time?
Again, it was really like I didn't fully realize I wanted to do law until a little bit later. And the way the application cycle works is, your percentage chance of getting into a certain school is a lot higher if you apply in September or October as opposed to in December and January or February. So you're really better off, if you make that decision late, you're better off taking a year off and getting your applications in September rather than applying in January and not having as good of a cycle. And so in the spirit of that, I took the year off and I ended up working retail jobs for a year, which was, not something I was initially excited about or looking forward to. But, looking back, I'm really glad that I did it because it's a good reminder of how fortunate I've been to have the support of people around me, to have the sort of the drive and the wherewithal and the guidance to kind of push myself into doing these sort of big things like going to law school. And it was a good reminder that most people aren't as fortunate as those of us who are lucky enough to attend a school like Lawrence and have those opportunities. And I think without that perspective that I got from that year, I don't know if I would have been as successful in my first year of law school, because I would not have I wouldn't have been able to tell myself like, this is not really that bad. I am, even though I'm reading all the time and I'm working really hard and I just want to stop and I want to take a break. This is not that bad compared to what a lot of other people go through in their daily lives. And so instead of complaining, it allowed me to be more grateful for what I had, which helped me a lot.
You mentioned that applications for law schools submitted in the fall are looked at more favorably than those turned in later in the cycle. What's the reason for that?
I'm not 100% sure. I would guess it's something to do with there are more seats open in the fall because applications are just opening up. So schools are a little bit more free to, if your LSAT isn't quite what they're looking for, if your GPA isn't quite what they're looking for, but you have something else on your resume, or you really make a connection with whatever group of people are reviewing your application, you're more likely to get accepted because they aren't worried about maintaining their median LSAT or their median GPA. There's going to be a little bit of inside baseball, but for those who don't know who are listening to this, schools will pretend otherwise, as they always do, but especially for law school, the two primary drivers of your application and the success that you will have in applying to schools are your LSAT score and your undergraduate GPA. And schools, for better or for worse, they really want to maintain their spot in these various rankings of law schools because it impacts the prestige level. It means it'll draw more people. Their graduates will go work for larger firms and make more money and donate more to the school. And it's this cycle of positive feedback that comes from being higher ranked. And so in order to do that, they want to maintain or raise their median scores for their LSAT and their GPA as much as they can. And so if you get to the end of a cycle as opposed to the beginning of a cycle, and the admissions counselors are really thinking about, okay, we need to maintain these medians, and you're above one or below the other, you're less likely to get admitted because the focus at that point is maintaining those statistics above all else. And I'm not saying like every school is super nitty gritty about it. I'm not saying every, admissions counselor is just focused on that. I don't have any experience. That's just my best guess. And it seems to make sense from what I've heard. For all intents and purposes, you're much better off applying in September or October to minimize the chances of that happening.
Since we are talking a bit about the LSAT, I'd like to ask you about the specifics of getting into law school before we get into what law school is like. How did you prepare for that LSAT? Is there a prep service you would recommend students use before they take that LSAT?
So I started preparing for the LSAT in July of 2020 or maybe June. I did take a prep course, but before I kind of get into that, I do want to emphasize that really your LSAT score, like for better or for worse, is the most important part of your application. And it's really, really important. I know a lot of people kind of just took the ACT or the SAT and just, get what you get. I was one of those kids that did that, to be quite frank. You can't do that with the LSAT. It is a test not of what you know, but a test of how you think, which means it's also really not something you can cram for. If you can't afford a prep course, or if you are unable to get access to a grant that gives you money for a prep course, there are free like Kaplan LSAT prep or Khan Academy prep that you can use, but it is essential that you take, really like 2 hours a day, probably 5 days a week for 3 or 4 months, where you're really trying to prepare for the LSAT and get the absolute best score that you can. Because even if you're not aiming to be at an elite school and you just want to have a law degree, you just want to go to help people, which is great, a higher LSAT score will get you a more substantial scholarship and you will graduate with far less debt. So that's another way of looking at it too, is, my Princeton Review LSAT 165, which shout out to Lawrence's Career Center, because I was able to get that for free with the experiential learning grant, which, I don't know if things have changed, but to the best of my knowledge, that's still available. Maybe you can correct me on. Yeah. So I would, Laurentians, I would look out for that. If you can get the money for that and make that investment, $1,500 might seem like a lot now, but it could be the difference of seriously like $20,000 or $30,000 a year for school. It could save you $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 in the long term just because you got a higher score on the test. What I did is I prepared for 3 months and I probably studied 2 to 3 hours a day. And I was in a prep class that met 2 to 3 times a week. Yeah, I mean, that's really what I would recommend. Like you gotta take it seriously. You gotta prepare in advance. It's not a test that you can cram for. And it really is so important in terms of what schools you can get into and what schools you can get money from.
Tell me more about your first year at law school, or 1L as it's called. What should potential students expect? Are there general courses that all students can expect to take no matter where they go to school?
Generally speaking, everybody takes the same set of courses no matter where you go to school your first year. So it'll depend on the semester, but everybody does constitutional law, everybody does contracts, everybody does torts, which is a fancy French word for injuries, civil cases. Everybody does civil procedure, everybody does criminal law, everybody does property. Some schools have you take like a legislation and regulation class. Some schools highly suggest that, like Minnesota does, but it's an elective and there's other options. And then everybody takes a legal research and writing class, and most schools have some sort of practical skills class as well. We at Minnesota have law and practice, which was a semester long. You don't take all of these at once, it's split between semesters, but it's mostly the same at each school. I think really for everybody, it's so different from what you're used to in terms of just, learning how to read legal cases and what to look for, and then, what's important for preparing for class versus what's important for the exam. Big change is in most undergraduate institutions, there's a breakdown, a split in terms of how you're graded. There's participation, and then you have maybe a midterm, you have a couple of projects, maybe you have quizzes, assignments, and then you have a final. Most law school classes, particularly quote unquote doctrinals, where you're learning about different areas of the law, 100% of your grade is based on the final exam.
Wow, that's a big change from Lawrence then.
It changes the way that you prepare for class and how you prepare throughout the semester, knowing that your outcome for that class is determined based on that one test. The other big thing that folks might not be aware of that you should know before going to law school is that law school is graded on a curve. And it is not a curve in that if the highest score is a 78, that person gets bumped to an A and then everybody else gets adjusted accordingly. There's a set number of A's, there's a set number of A minuses, set number of B pluses. So for example, there were 75 people in my section, which is the group of people that I had all my classes with my first year. In each of those full classes with 75 people, 10 people could get A's, 15 people could get A minuses, and then I think it was like 25 people could get B pluses. And that varied a little bit from class to class, but generally, like, the rule is you have to finish among the top third of your classmates on the exam in order to get an A or an A minus. And that's really where the difficulty of 1L comes from, because, you get to law school and everybody's smart, everybody's diligent, everybody's talented, and we're all working hard. And so you really have to decide how much you want it, whether or not it's worth it for you before you make that commitment, because it is a lot of work and it is a lot of stress. But especially if you can make it through that first year, the rest of the way, like, it's still going to be a decent amount of work, but once you've done it once, it becomes a lot easier.
That grading system is interesting. Is there a reason why they do it that way, or how do they explain that to you at school?
We asked our contracts professor about this, and he told us, if it wasn't curved, everybody would get A's because you guys are all smart and you guys all work hard. And so there needs to be some way to differentiate between people. Some professors write really hard tests, and, a 60 out of 100 can be an A, and a 51 out of 100 can be a B minus. Most professors, at least at Minnesota, are very good about writing their tests, and they have an understanding of, okay, how many people, like what is the distribution of outcomes going to be on this thing? And so you don't really have a ton of situations where there is this really, really tight curve and people are getting such different grades based on just a few points. But at other schools that can happen from time to time. And so that's why, again, it's just so important to, really gain an understanding of how to prepare for an exam and how to succeed in that environment versus undergrad where, you have little things that build up over time.
Well, I can see where between the new type of school and new faculty and new ways of reading and learning and getting grades and just the overall pace of things can make that first year at law school really stressful. But you also said that years 2 and 3 can be less stressful.
So there's a common saying in law school that in 1L they scare you to death, in 2L they work you to death, and in 3L they bore you to death. So yeah, as a first year student, it's really just the pressure of not knowing where you stand and wanting to be the best that you can be. I will say you don't have to get a 4.0 in law school in order to get a job. You don't. You don't have to get a 4.0. You don't have to get a 3.5. You might not be working for the best and biggest firms, but if your goal is to do meaningful work, helping people in a community, and you get a law degree, you'll be able to do that. If your goal is to make money, you'll be able to do that. It's difficult enough to get a JD that there will be opportunities for you and you will be able to do that. But I would just say, yes, it is hard. I feel it's important to say that and to be honest about it and be a little frank, because it's not something that you should go into lightly, because it will dominate a lot of your time. It will be stressful. You will question whether or not you want to be there from time to time. But if you come into law school knowing what to expect and knowing it's going to be difficult, it's easier to have the resolve and the determination to push through it anyway and be able to find that success.
For you, did you go into law school knowing what type of law you plan to practice? Or does the first year give you kind of exposure to a variety of different types of law that you can pick from? It sounds like you had a variety of classes, yet everyone takes the same classes. So how do you end up deciding which type of law you want to do? Where does that decision kind of finally happen?
So yeah, your second and third year, you get to pick your classes. There's a couple of classes that they want everybody to take that they require. There's an ethics class that we all take, but for the most part, you pick your classes, and that's kind of how you dip your feet in and figure out areas of law might you want to try. One thing that is great about Minnesota is there are a lot of experiential learning opportunities. So there's a pretty robust externship program with employers all across the Twin Cities. And there's also a clinical program where you can actually work with attorneys and, as a supervised student attorney, actually do legal work in certain fields. So there's a tax clinic, there's a bankruptcy clinic, federal immigration, appellate level clinic. I think there's a human rights clinic. There's now a gun violence prevention clinic that just started. There's a sports law clinic. So pretty much any area of law that you think you might be interested in, there are experiential opportunities to become involved and to kind of dip your feet in and figure out, okay, what would this actually be like? And then you can take classes. Like next semester, I'm taking business associations and I'm taking secured transactions to kind of get an idea of, is transactional law, like mergers and acquisitions, equity, is that kind of, for me, is that something I'm going to enjoy? And so, those classes are really the best opportunity to kind of get an idea of, could you see yourself doing it? And you have 4 semesters to kind of dip your feet in all over the place and figure out, okay, what area of law might I want to do? And, a lot of firms, when they take you in, like for a summer program, they are going to rotate you between a bunch of different practice groups. And even in your first year of practice after law school, they will rotate you between practice groups and kind of give you the ability to kind of reach in and grab work from all of these different areas, which is really nice, because, even after you finish law school, there's still a decent chunk of people that aren't 100% sure. Law school helps narrow it down, and it helps a lot of people, like most people, I think, figure out what they want to do. But, even professionally, once you're done with school, there's plenty of opportunities to really hone down into what you want to specialize in.
So it does sound like there's a lot of experiential opportunities, either during the year or during summers, where you can get a lot of experience to help make those decisions.
Yeah, it's pretty robust. Your first year, they really want you to get that foundation of law. They want you to know about all of these core concepts that come up all of the time and that are widely featured on the bar exam as well. But really after that, you're a little bit more free to kind of dive into what you want to do.
Do you have an idea yet what you're going to do?
I have a list. On the sort of like the litigation side, which is appearing in court, people traditionally think of when they think of a lawyer. I'm interested in antitrust enforcement. I'm interested in sort of commercial litigation as well. I'm interested in white collar defense. Being a private detective for a firm sounds really fun. Yeah, that sounds really cool. And then there's what's called transactional law, which is more of, like a corporate lawyer, so to speak, where you're not going into court and you're more behind the scenes working on, advising deal teams, for example. And that's like, think mergers and acquisitions, think debt financing, think capital markets, private equity. And that's an area of interest for me as well, mainly because it's so collegial. The number one complaint that people hear with litigation is that it's so adversarial and it can get really nasty really quick. Whereas with transactional law, usually one side wants a new toy in the form of a new company, and the other side wants a pile of money. And if the deal goes through, everybody's happy. So that sounds like a nicer world to inhabit than the world of litigation. So I certainly have some pondering to do, but a lot of the places that I'm looking at for employment are very, understanding of that, because that's pretty typical for a lot of law students in my position. Don't feel like I should stress to listeners, don't feel like you have to commit to a certain area of law. And even when you get to law school, be open-minded toward other areas of law. Like, I can't tell you how many of my friends came in gung-ho about public interest law and then have now been doing work in some sort of public interest capacity over the summer, and now are thinking more and more about firm life instead. So yeah, keep your options open, keep an open mind, because you might be surprised.
We talked earlier about how different law school is from Lawrence, but I would also think that Lawrence was helpful in preparing for law school.
Honestly, I feel very fortunate to be at Minnesota because of the similarities to Lawrence. Professors hold regular office hours. They're open to scheduling meetings. They're very approachable. They're very understanding if you don't get something right away. There is another thing students should know about, is there's this thing called cold calling in law school, which some professors don't do, and some professors are a little, I guess, nicer about, in that they kind of warn you in advance. Generally speaking, in law school, you are liable to be called on and to have to defend a position and maybe explain a case that we were reading every single day. So you come to class, you sit down, you really, you need to make sure that you've, read so that you understand what's going to be discussed, because the professor might just call on you out of the blue and you're going to have to explain your position. You can't tell a professor that you're just not feeling great and that you'd rather not be called on. Like, some professors are okay with that once in a while. Some professors will just do like a 2 or 3 strike rule so that you can have passes if you need it. But most of the time, like, you need to do the reading, you need to be prepared, you need to be on, because you're liable to get called on. But even in cold calls, like, if a professor sees that you're struggling, or that you're not having a great day and that you're at least trying, they will usually just move on to somebody else. And they're usually pretty good at reading the room in that capacity. Other similarities to Lawrence. Yeah, I mean, not every law school is like this. I want to stress that before I make this point. I found Minnesota students to be very collegial. There's some competitiveness, but not too much. Generally speaking, people don't really talk about grades. People don't really get braggadocious about, if they have a certain job that they secure that's considered to be really prestigious or not prestigious, or there isn't a whole lot of discussion about that. People are pretty chill. at Minnesota. That's not true at every law school, though. I do want to emphasize, and it's really important when you're picking a law school to ask current students who are not admissions ambassadors and who are more likely to give you the truth, to be honest about what the culture at the school is like, because there are some schools I know that are a lot less collegial and a lot more competitive and nasty, and some people really like that. Some people want that motivation, they want that fire, and others don't. So it's really, really important that you get honest thoughts about just any school's culture that you're considering attending.
Are there any classes with certain professors that you would recommend current Lawrence students take if they're considering the law school route?
I would say the classes that most prepared me for law school were the two classes that I took with Professor Stephen Wolf in the government department. First was Politics and Human Nature, and the second was actually Intro to Constitutional Law. For Laurentians who are not familiar with Professor Wolf, you read a lot of older philosophical texts, you discuss them in class, and then his big thing is he gives out writing assignments where he gives you a prompt and you have to make arguments relating to that prompt and kind of show that you understand both sides before coming to a conclusion. That is very much what a law school exam is like. You take your knowledge of the rules and how to apply those rules as you learned throughout the semester, and you get given a question or a series of essay questions on an exam where you are expected to apply the law to the facts and show that you understand the arguments that reasonable lawyers on both sides of the conundrum would make before coming to a conclusion. So if you want to get an idea for what a law school exam is like, at least in principle, I would take classes with Professor Wolf, because that's really what helped me. I would also on this topic generally say, if you feel like you're weak in a certain area, like if you feel like maybe you're not as good of a writer, maybe it would be a good idea to take more like English classes so that you can become a better writer. If you feel like your logical reasoning ability isn't there, take more philosophy classes, maybe take an economics class or political science. If you're nervous about that hurting your GPA, because that does matter for getting into schools, remember to just use your SUs. Lawrence gives SUs to students for a reason, and if you use them properly for that, you can really focus on learning those new skills without having to worry too much about, oh my God, am I meeting the rubric perfectly? What happens if I get a 90% instead of a 93? It allows you to be more focused on skill development, which is very important before you enter law school.
Turning back to law school again, what kind of advice do you have regarding the overall timeline?
I would say my general advice that I would give, if you're a freshman or a sophomore right now listening to this, don't worry too much about law school, but make sure when you're choosing a major, you choose something that you can do well in and that you enjoy doing. One big thing that I didn't know until my senior year of senior year of Lawrence, was it really doesn't matter what you major in before coming to law school. It doesn't matter if you're a STEM major or if you do econ or if you do government or if you do, art history. Schools are going to look at your GPA the same no matter what. I would say, again, pick something that you like, pick something that you're going to want to do, and pick something that you're good at so that you can get that GPA as high as you possibly can. And then my advice for juniors and seniors would be, think about taking that year off. A lot of people are going to have to work. Most people, I would say, are going to have to work during that year off. If you can plan to do the LSAT your summer of your junior year, your summer of your senior year, and maybe start studying for it in May and take it in September and then apply the following September, if you can take a year or two off, I think you'll be in a better position in terms of your actual strength of your application. And having a couple years away from school lets you kind of decompress from the running hard that is Lawrence, the trimester system. And it also makes you a lot more disciplined in that, you're working 40 hours a week. You're expected to show up at 9 a.m. every day or 10 to 6 or whatever hours you are. You're expected to be doing your job while you're at work. and you're going to have an advantage because of that coming into law school. So just to sum that up, freshmen and sophomores, don't worry too much yet. Have fun, but pick a major that you like and that you think you're gonna do well in. Juniors and seniors, think about taking a year or two off. And I would strongly suggest applying for that experiential learning grant through the Career Center, get a prep course, and make sure you put the time in to study for the LSAT, because it's really not something that you can cram for.
As we mentioned earlier, you did take that year off before going to law school. So you had a chance, you had a year to experience, quotation marks here, the real world for a while.
Yeah.
What about post-Lawrence life surprised you most?
I think the big thing is, unlike Lawrence, you really have to take ownership for kind of directing your life in the way that you want it to go. Not saying you don't have to do that at Lawrence at all, but when you're in college, breaks kind of naturally present themselves. You have your classes throughout the day, you do some work. Most of the time you can take weekends off and you can enjoy it. A lot of times you can take Friday nights off. You're going to have a 4-day kind of mini vacation in the middle of every trimester. And you're going to have, regular social events being put on around campus that makes it easy for you to find fun. And really, once you graduate as an adult, people aren't doing that for you anymore. So I think the big thing that I would say is be prepared to, you have to really be the one to take responsibility for taking care of yourself and living the best life that you can. And I just would say, enjoy your time in college. Sometimes my friends and I would complain about stuff that was going on campus that we were frustrated with. But in retrospect, that seems like little stuff now compared to all of the fun we had and the good memories that we shared. So I would just say, cherish your 4 years at Lawrence, because it goes by quick. And then once you become an adult, not saying being an adult sucks, it's still fun. You're going to have to work for that fun a little bit more. So just cherish those 4 years.
And that, folks, is really smart advice from a really smart guy. Basil Eastman-Kiesow from the Lawrence class of 2021. Thank you for joining us on the Career Center podcast.
Pleasure. Happy to be here. Happy.